Hello Internet, Seth Skorkowski, and normally when I do one of my RPG philosophy videos, they're usually pretty organized. I state an argument of how I feel on some topic, explain why, and then some conclusion that I've been able to make from that. However, some of my other thoughts, they don't cleanly fall into a single area, sort of that nebulous in-between zone. These are the messier, sort of half-formed opinions, like the primordial ooze of RPG philosophy, or they're exceptions to other philosophies. I regularly say how there is always exceptions. This is how it is, except for when it isn't. And some of those exceptions can be small, while others can be fairly large. And what I do is I jot down all these in kind of a big ideas document. And over time, I'll flesh them out a little bit more, organize my thoughts, until eventually I have enough for hopefully a decent and thought out video on that topic. Other ideas, however, just sit there because I never seem to figure out how to articulate them, at least not be able to articulate them in a way that doesn't just sound like, an old man yells at clouds style rant. And they're not rants about individuals like bad players or bad game master behavior, but more about things that I notice in the gaming community and in the gaming culture. And I do think about these topics pretty often, but I never voice those opinions because my thoughts on it are kind of messy and might easily come off as, incorrectly, not what I'm intending for it to sound like. Now, this video is one of those topics, a messy collection of thoughts and personal rants, hopefully leading to a solid conclusion. Maybe it'll get some viewers thinking about this topic, discuss it, and maybe through those dialogues, help me make a bit more sense of it, because it's something that I think about often, and I do want to explore and share and get some other perspectives on, because in all honesty, I really just want to get this one out of my system once and for all. So you're going to ask the internet to help you out with some half-formed opinions and hot takes. God have mercy on your soul, brother. Yeah, dude, you're going to get eaten alive. Actually, I'm pretty confident on this one. Yeah, I gripe about commenters all the time, but truth be told, I've built a really good community around my channel and a lot of great people, a lot of regulars that come back. They'll regularly answer questions, or they'll really give a good counterpoint or a good addendum to anything that I have to say and kind of build that discussion. So I really am interested in what it is they have to say, maybe something that they can kind of point out where I'm wrong at or something that they can emphasize. So I really am interested in what they have to say on this. It's your funeral, but it should be fun to watch. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is something that I come across quite a lot, and that's the habit of blaming game masters for every single problem at the table, specifically bad player habits and behavior. Now, I do apologize that this video is about to be all over the place in my full ADHD glory, because we're about to take a really roundabout way of getting to that. Because first, I want to talk about railroading. More of a story, really, but one that dovetails into what inspired me to finally address this video that's been lurking around in my head for the past few years. Railroading is a pretty common topic in tabletop games. The earliest mention that I've been able to stumble across for it was in the Dungeoneer's Survival Guide for First Edition AD&D, and I'm pretty sure it appeared in the community well before that. I touched on it before in my very first 7 Deadly Game Master Sins video. Railroading is when a game master removes a player's choice and forces their hand in order to achieve some sort of set outcome, instead of offering the players a situation and letting the players figure out and decide for themselves how they want to overcome that situation. The game master offers a situation that comes with some sort of predetermined way that the player characters are supposed to solve it. Sort of like the game master has written a novel and the players are simply going through the motion of playing it out, like hostage actors playing out the game master's script. This is an area that does deserve a lot more to it. I have a lot of thoughts on this subject, especially on the subject of players who confuse any sort of story plot for being a railroad, or, game masters who railroad their players without realizing they're railroading their players, and the whole time they don't think that that's what they're doing, but we can delve deeper into that topic on another day. Anyway, I was reading the blog over at the Alexandrian where he was discussing abused gamer syndrome, which is when players who are used to having a railroading game master begin approaching the game by looking for the tracks, finding the expected way that it is that they're supposed to go, out of fear of being punished by their game master. It then goes on to how these, screwed up players eventually leave the group, join another group, and then carry on that habit, carrying that with them. And then when they encounter a game where there is no railroad, they get frustrated or act out because they can't find the tracks, which they assume the tracks are there because there's always tracks in games. So, they think maybe the game master is screwing with them and this is some sort of trick, and all the problems that this can lead to because the player is looking for something that is not there. It is an absolutely wonderful blog, and it ended up leading me down a rabbit hole of his entire railroading series. I'll stick a link down below for it. It is definitely worth the read. Now, eventually I got to his article on players who want to be railroaded, which sums up the 4 causes of why a player would want to be railroaded, as number 1, they had a bad experience with a poorly executed sandbox once. 2, they don't know what railroading means when they say they want to be railroaded, in part created by game masters who don't want them to think that their railroading is actually railroading. 3, they're apathetic and don't want to make decisions, with the mention that this might be the result of abused gamer syndrome from a previously bad game master. Or finally, they're not only unwilling to make decisions, but they don't want the rest of the players making decisions either, and how these players are poison. Once again, it's great stuff. I'll put a link down below if you'd like a little bit more of a detailed explanation, because I don't want to talk about what Mr. Alexander said in his blog. I'm fine with all that. It is on point, and this really isn't about the blog, merely what inspired my train of thought that eventually led to me making this video. So what I want to address is what that blog left out, which is a glaring hole in many discussions about player behavior and what it is that players want in games. Are we going to get to the topic now? Nope, because now it's time for a story that the Alexandrian blog reminded me of. I don't get to play video games as much as I used to. Mostly time, that became an issue when I started writing seriously, so I stopped playing video games as much. But one game series that I have always loved for many years is Hitman. For those not familiar with it, Hitman games are assassination missions. You get a target, sometimes a secondary objective like steal a file, then it drops you off in some possibly exotic location and just lets you go. There's no set or correct way that you can go about doing it. It can be stealth, disguise, just a full-on bloodbath. There are a lot of different options. Sometimes while playing, I'll have snuck into a building, and once inside I discover a window or a sewer grate or something like that I hadn't noticed before, and that could have been another way that I could have gotten inside the building. So I end up finishing the mission, and then I go back and I play it again using that other entrance that I found, kind of playing out all the different possibilities of which way it could have gone. And there's not really a wrong way that you can beat a level, but I love the fact that it gives you so many possibilities and all the different possibilities that game allows. So I've frequently replayed level, one after another, trying all these different methods out. Anyway, years ago, like 2007, I guess, I had a buddy. Okay, I still do have this buddy. I'm just trying to say it was about 15 years ago back. But for the sake of this video, we're going to call my buddy Dweebles. Hi! So my buddy and I played some AD&D at the time. It was our first/second edition hybrid that we used to play, and I mentioned to him one day how much I loved the Hitman video game, and he said that he'd check it out, so I loaned him my disc because it was the Dark Ages and that's how we did it at the time. Now, not long after that, he gave me the disc back, saying that it really wasn't his jam. I asked him why, and he said, "It was just too open. I want to figure out the way that I'm supposed to do it. Kind of like solving a puzzle." That was weird to me, but I figured, everybody's got different tastes in video games. Anyway, a year later, I started running us through some Cyberpunk 2020. And one of my favorite Cyberpunk games to run are heist games. I love them. I got a whole video on how to do them. And how I do a heist is I make a detailed location, give the players an objective, and then I just let them go, and I sit back and I marvel at all the crazy plans and hijinks that ensue. Most of my players absolutely loved it. Brother, that was an awesome game. Yeah, we should play more of this. But Dweebles didn't, so later on I asked him about it, and he said, "It felt like there wasn't any sort of plan at all. I couldn't figure out how we were supposed to do it." And that puzzled me, but then he said, "Dude, this isn't a game of freaking Hitman." And that was when I started to understand. My buddy was upset at me, and he was mad because I did not railroad him. He wanted to figure out what the correct solution to the adventure was. You see, I loved Hitman because to me it was wide open, and it also reminded me of playing Cyberpunk, so something I got to play when I wasn't able to play Cyberpunk, and you can be stealthily, brutally violent, whatever it is you want to do. And all that mattered for that game is closing the contract. So I'd assumed that his not liking Hitman was simply a video game preference and not an overall preference towards games in general, because, tabletop games and computer games are pretty different. But I eventually figured out what my buddy's preferences were. His favorite video games were strategic or puzzles, games like Portal. He also excelled at board games, again strategy games, where he got to figure out what the optimal and most efficient way to win was. He wasn't a fan of games that don't really have a clearly defined strategy to always win, or a clearly defined sequence of actions that must be followed and figured out in order to complete the game. So, as I said, we used to play AD&D together, and we did a lot of dungeon crawls, and dungeons, by their nature, have very clear choices. The passage splits before you, you can go left or you can go right, those are pretty much your only options there. That's what he enjoyed doing, was figuring out the correct answer for a clear question. So am I playing a very open, wide open heist game where there really wasn't any predetermined path of how it was they're supposed to do it or any path at all? That just wasn't his thing, because he enjoyed games that provided a clear and definite path for him to discover. Essentially, he just wanted to find the rails. And is he wrong for liking that? No, if that's what he enjoys, then that's what he enjoys. But that wasn't the result of all the things the Alexandrian listed as reasons that he preferred just to be railroad. It wasn't that he didn't understand the terminology or he didn't want to make decisions, and it sure as hell wasn't him being the victim of a bad game master. Over the years, I've done several videos discussing player mistakes and bad players. And one thing that I quickly noticed is when you're discussing bad player behavior, almost every single one of those videos, and I'm not going to say every single one because maybe there was an exception, but I'm going to say almost every single one. But whether I'm discussing analysis paralysis, steamrolling other players, murder hobos, RPG terrorists, cheaters, I have received the reply that the reason behind those habits are usually, if not always, the game master's fault. That the player behavior is either their reaction to something bad that their game master is doing or some previous game master has done to them before. Essentially, it's always the product of abused gamer syndrome. My personal favorite of these comments was supposedly by Dave Arneson, but my Google skills have yet to verify if this is a real quote or not, saying that there's no bad players or characters, only bad dungeon masters. So what I guess through that player that burns the game down because they're a jerk, it gets off on ruining everybody's good time, that's the game master's fault that player is just a dick? Several other commenters have gone on saying that my own experience with having bad player behavior was a direct result of me being a terrible game master, essentially boiling down the idea that all players are blameless of any wrongdoing, devoid of flaws or individual personality, and if the game master has trouble with a player, it is their own damn fault. Meanwhile, I've also made several videos about game master sins, going over the various game master mistakes, freely confessing to my own past guilt on almost every single sin that I do. But one difference is in the response to those, I don't think I've ever gotten a single response about game master bad behavior as being the fault of the players. Essentially the idea that, yeah, a game master can definitely screw up, and we can all freely admit that the game master screwed up here, juxtaposed against a very small but vocal few that the players who screw up or pick up any bad habits or anything like that, those are actually the game master's fault as well, making them all just a victim of a bad game master. So any and all blame for anything that goes wrong in a game falls on the game master. And that is a toxic mindset, absolving players of any responsibility while placing 100% of the blame and the burden on the game master. That is just terrible. We're demanding perfection, and whether that game master has been running the game for 40 years or we're their 13-year-old kid and this is their very first session ever, that is an unfair amount of pressure. Now, can a game master's mistakes and bad behavior cause bad behavior from their players who can eventually carry that off into further groups? Absolutely, of course. I've brought that up many times before. That cannot be understated. However, while we're discussing the idea of bad player habits and where those are rooted in, and there's a lot of finger pointing is going on as to where they picked up that bad habit, one glaring suspect is rarely ever mentioned: video games. So many of the player and game master habits and behaviors that can damage or ruin the enjoyment of other people around the table, a lack of expected consequences, linear enforced plots, main character syndrome, random violence and mayhem, or simply unreasonable expectations, many of those can be directly linked to features that we can find in video games, such as in the Alexandrian's whole series on railroads. I enjoyed it. It gave me a lot to think about. But computer game RPGs, those have been around for decades now. We have years and years of new players coming into tabletop games for the very first time, but with a foundation that they have built on playing these video games. And that has made a huge impact on what different players have when they come in, what they expect, the habits they've formed, and it is silly that we don't just acknowledge that as a possibility and we're making all the accusations and blame throwing that happen around the table as to where these problems possibly came from. Or like my buddy, it got mad at me for not laying down a track for him to follow. We should also acknowledge that a player might just simply have a personal preference that's not the same as our own, but that doesn't mean that they're wrong. It doesn't mean that they're really the victims of abuse or unaware of what it is that they really enjoy, or they're just ignorant of the correct way to have fun and we need to teach them how. Which really does sound arrogant, does it? You're wrong about what you like, so let me tell you what that is. I've talked about personal preference before and sharing a table with people that don't like what it is that you like and the problem that that can lead to, but it's still no one's fault. No one is wrong. It's simply a conflict of taste and personality. Or even traits like being overly paranoid. When I covered that, people were quick to say that an over-paranoid player is always the product of an abusive game master. But over the last 2 newbies that I brought into our games, one of them was a complete newbie to gaming altogether. They came into their very first game with that over-paranoid mindset, thinking the game master was going to try to screw them over because that's what they would do if they were game mastering that game. And they hadn't yet learned how tabletop games work, or that game master is actually kind of rooting for the players rather than trying to work against them. So we actually had to teach them how to not be as paranoid, trying to figure out how it was that game tables really work, and that the game master wasn't their enemy. Nobody taught them that. That's just how they arrived. So when it comes to bad or disruptive habits, there are a ton of possible sources out there. However, when talking about them in blogs and podcasts and forums or YouTube videos like this one, we tend to focus on the factors that we can control in order to correct this behavior, in order to fix everything. And since we can't control the fact that player has come in with a lifetime worth of bad habits that they've picked up in video games, or might simply just have some personal preference or some personality trait that we can't fix that, so we tend to ignore those as things that we're going to talk about because there's nothing we can do. So instead we focus on the table itself. The most likely culprit is what caused this problem, and the person who's also most likely going to be reading a blog about this, the game master. Because if the game master is the root cause for whatever problem it is that we're having, hopefully they can learn to change that behavior and correct the problem, and can make everything happier around the table. So a good game master should regularly consider when they're having problems of, am I the problem here? That is great. That makes sense. However, by not even bringing up those other completely valid sources as to where this issue might be coming from, removing them entirely from the conversation, it starts coming off that the game master is the only culprit for problems around the table, and that we start blaming the game master because nothing else was even listed as a possible reason for what's causing this, which is extremely unfair to the game master and encourages a toxic mentality of blaming him for every single little thing around the table, and it does absolutely nothing to help us identify the source of these problems and fixing them for our own table, so it doesn't help any of us. If nothing else, it only makes it worse. So in conclusion, if there really is a conclusion to this jumbled mess of a video here, anyone experiencing problems at the table should consider that those problems are really reactions or consequences to their own behavior, especially if you're the game master, because you're going to have the most influence around everybody around the table. And that is healthy to consider that, and that's how we improve. And determining the cause for whatever that problem is best done through open and honest communication between everybody around the table, and done regularly. And, hopefully we can be honest enough and we can figure out whatever the cause of that is. And if it is our own behavior that's causing it, hopefully we can change our behavior and keep that from, continuing to happen again or in the future if it's already been too late for that one player. But we also need to remember that the causes for certain problems around the table are completely outside anyone's control, but that doesn't mean that we should ignore them entirely or just pretend that they don't exist. Or we shouldn't be treating players like they're devoid of any sort of human personality or history when they come in, and kind of saying that they're innocent of anything that they do, or blindly blanket blaming game masters for any and all problems, because that isn't going to help anyone. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you want to see some more of our stuff, such as game reviews or more RPG philosophy, just hit that subscribe button. Until next time, amigos, stay awesome. It's been a long time since we played some Hitman. We should correct that.